So onward to our first speaker. Our first speaker is Sir Alistair MacDonald, who began his career as a teacher and then head teacher for 21 years in East London in Tower Hamlets. In this time, he guided the school to a period of significant growth in attainment, taking the school forward with Ofsted inspections in 2007 and 2013, rating Morpeth School as outstanding. The school was the London Evening Standard's first ever most improved school, which is kind of one of those metrics I think that really matters, right? Alistair has brought his experience and knowledge working across London in education and indeed in Malawi and Papua New Guinea as well. He's led national groups, held positions advising, including a national review of person, social, and health education. And I think his experience is evidence of the power of a truly shared process and responsibility, and recognizing that any of these topics that we're dealing with today, in particular education right now, really are cross-cutting in their impact of making livable cities. He's currently working with the Welsh Government as an advocate for pupil deprivation, for the Pupil Deprivation Grant, and he's a champion on the Schools Challenge in Cymru program. I welcome him today and look forward to hearing his thoughts.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. And I see that old habits die hard. You all sit at the back of the classroom, not the front. It's a great pleasure to be here. I have to admit, until 2 or 3 years ago, I didn't really know Cardiff very well. And if I tell you that a lot of my experiences were based on going to Cardiff Arms Park, you'll realise how long back you have to go to realise my contact with Cardiff. However, for the last 2 or 3 years, I have been working in Wales, as Alison has said, on both the Schools Challenge Cymru programme and as advocate for the Pupil Deprivation Grant. I must admit, I don't like the term very much. It's one of those things, the deprivation bit. Anyway, we can't change that. But what I have become aware of, I think particularly, is, Cardiff is a great city. But what strikes me always when I come here, it has the potential to be even better. There's something about it, I just feel it's sitting somewhere on the cusp of something, and it could be a great city, or an even greater city. I think it won't surprise you, obviously, that I think that absolutely fundamental and crucial to that happening will be education. I don't think you can have a great city without a great education system. And I'm going to talk for about 25 minutes, probably, and then leave 15 minutes for questions, if people want to ask questions. And I'm going to focus on my experience in London. I'm always a bit wary about talking about London or England when I'm in Wales, but I trust that you will accept that being Scottish, I bring a degree of scepticism to what happens in England. And I certainly do not buy a lot of what has happened there. There is some good stuff. So I want to talk about my experience over the last couple of decades and what's happened there. I think it's quite important just very quickly to give you context, and some of this will be quite education school based, but I hope that I will be able to draw out of it some of the lessons that I think are important. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at where we were, going back about 15, 20 years actually, what our ambition was at that time, the changes that have taken place, what I see as the critical success features in those changes, the strategies that we employed, an analysis of how it actually happened, and that's quite contentious, and what actually made the difference, and then possible lessons. It looks like a long list, but I'll move through it fairly quickly. So looking at the context, just very briefly to remind you, most of my experience was in Tower Hamlets, which is East London. You're probably familiar with EastEnders. That's the map that you get there. We're right in the centre of that. And it's got everything from the Tower of London to traditional old, tenement blocks, more recent blocks, and of course Canary Wharf is right in the centre of the borough. In terms of the key points. There's some interesting things here. I don't like reading slides because I know you can all read. But one of the things I think is quite interesting here is that Tower Hamlets is very unusual. The people who work in Tower Hamlets have the highest average income anywhere in Britain. The people who live there have the lowest average income of people who live anywhere in Britain. It's an interesting contrast, and that's because we have Canary Wharf and we have bits of the City of London as well. So it's a very unusual place in that sense. The second bullet point is quite important as well. Tower Hamlets is the best funded education authority in England. And I think, I feel quite strongly, for several years we were the most improved local education authority in England. The two are linked. If you're prepared to spend money, you do get results, I think. But like Cardiff, we have this huge diversity, this richness in the population. And I think that's one of the things which I see in Cardiff. There's something fantastic about the diversity we now have and the opportunities and the energy which that brings. Anyway, my school itself, as you can see, I won't dwell on this. The big pink blob is pupils of Bangladeshi origin. The school was predominantly the largest single group were children from Bangladeshi homes. Large school, lots of pupils with statements of special educational need, very high levels of free school meals, 70% free school meals, that kind of thing. And I want to just talk about this because I think we forget, and I sometimes feel like I have to be an advocate for schools. Schools tend to get a hard time, and schools tend to come in for a lot of criticism and not a lot of praise. And I use this to illustrate not just my school, but schools in general. And I think if you were to look back at the schools in Wales, you'd find similar things. In 1992, okay, it's 25 years ago, there were 200 pupils in the school I was in taking exams. 16 of those got 5 good passes. 16 only. We had 2 students out of 200 going to higher education. 30% of the students left school with no qualification at all. You could leave school in those days at Easter of year 11, of the 5th year. You could leave school before you took any exams. And I think it was a different world. If you just listen to what Phil was saying just now about what's being achieved in Cardiff schools, on schools all over Wales and England, there has been huge progress. And it makes me angry at times when the media choose to focus on the more negative aspects. There has been a huge improvement. Schools are much better now than they were 20 years ago. No question whatsoever. Again, reading, I know you can do it, but I think this is quite important. This is from Andreas Schleicher. He's not the most popular man in Wales because he's the man behind PISA, and PISA is the thing which has shown, or appears to show, that children in Wales are not doing very well. I think there are all sorts of issues about PISA, but I think what he says is worth listening to. The most advanced education systems now set ambitious goals for all students, with a clear focus on equity and are clear about what students should be able to do. I emphasize that word all because I think it's absolutely crucial, and we'll come back to that a bit later. Excellence and equity in student performance are less related to a country's income or expenditure on education than to how those educational resources are allocated and to the policies, practices and learning environments. Really important stuff, I think, and although he comes in for a lot of criticism, I think he is worth listening to. Second thing from him, our data shows it doesn't matter if you go to school, any country in the world, pupils, students from privileged backgrounds do better than those from less privileged backgrounds. That's the reality, and I think that's the big challenge for us. Just to say, that's where we were. Where we have got to, the actual numbers don't matter. There are 3 lines on that graph. One is England, one is Tower Hamlets, the local authority where I was, and one is the school I was head of. I'm putting them there to illustrate that there has been a massive improvement. We mustn't underestimate that. and that this is against a backdrop of very high levels of deprivation, particularly in Tower Hamlets. So what actually made a difference then? What did we do? What were the features in terms of turning schools around and getting high-achieving schools? I don't want to go into too much detail on this because this is essentially more of a school-based sort of thing. But I think that what you have to do is in schools, you have to have order and structure before you can do anything else. You have to get that sorted out. And as Phil has said, I think if he was being honest, going back 3 or 4 years, in some of the schools in Cardiff, we didn't have that. I think there has been a big shift in what were the most challenging schools, and we're starting to see progress there. But without that order and structure and a real focus on learning, you can't do anything. The second thing is something which I feel quite passionate about, and I think it's where Cardiff is in a great place, great position. Educational capital. By that, what I mean is the capital that young people get, not just from school, but just from their families and so on. Think of it in terms of class. It's a bit, maybe slightly old-fashioned in some senses, but if you think of the difference between a middle-class child and the experiences which they have through their family, and you think of a child growing up in Merthyr or in Ebbw Vale or in some of the more challenging parts of Cardiff, there is a massive difference. And I think it's really important that we recognise that and are prepared to put resources in to actually providing our young people from more disadvantaged backgrounds with some of the experiences that middle-class children get. Cardiff is in a fantastic position to do that because there is so much on offer in the city, and I think there are so many ways in which that could be developed and those young people could have those experiences. I used to sometimes ask the teachers on the first day in September what they had done with their children during the 6 weeks holiday. And of course, it was a massive range of activities, from holidays to museums to going to the countryside. Fantastic range of things. If you ask the children the same question, most of them didn't move more than a mile or two from their home the whole 6 weeks holiday. And I was in a school in West Wales recently where the teacher was absolutely over the moon about the progress that her children had made in year 6. And they were all hitting level 5s. And she said, our big problem now is the children have got nothing to write about. So the actual language skills were right up there, but they had no experiences to write about. And I think that's tragic in some senses. Second thing, the third thing, and I think that's where the schools have got to get to, and the best schools in the world are really focusing on teaching and learning, thinking about how young people learn and how teachers can enable that to happen. That's within school. I think where Cardiff has got to get to, though, is also what happens between schools. In England, I said there are bits of what goes on there that I like, there are bits I don't like. I'm very unhappy with the marketisation of schools. I think schools being put into competition with each other is not healthy. And I think in Wales, we have the opportunity to avoid that. But we need to be careful, because with an emphasis on attainment, there's a huge temptation for schools to look after number one, to make sure they're all right. I think in the best education systems, schools care about each other as well. I always used to say as a head teacher that I wanted the school down the road to do just as well as us. And then I would say, well, not quite as well as us, but just about as well as us. And I think that's what you want. You want everybody to care about all the children, not just the ones in their school. And I think really good education systems, that happens. And that's where I think those in power have the ability to help that. The structures which they set up, the accountabilities that they set up will influence that. It will either force schools into competing or to collaborating. And we need a bit of both. London Challenge, which I was part of, and I'll come back to that later, was an attempt to do this. It was an attempt to say we all care about each other. The schools that are struggling will be helped by those that are doing better. And as I say, I think the greater the sense of corporate responsibility we can get, collective responsibility we can get, the more likely we are to be successful. Now this, I don't expect you to be able to read anything from this graph. It's far too complicated, there's far too much information on it. But what I do want to use it is to illustrate something. If you look at it, you should see that there are probably, I don't know, maybe 21 or something, pairs of graphs. Every single one of those, there is a pair of graphs. And what it does, it takes this part of South Wales, Cardiff is here. What each pair shows is the achievement on the left-hand side, the first of the pair, of the pupils who are on free school meals. The pupils who are eligible for the pupil deprivation grant. Those from disadvantaged backgrounds, their achievement, and the second half of the pair shows those who are not on free school meals. Now, this is the thing which I think is the big issue that we face. However good our education system is, going back to Andreas Schleicher, if there isn't more equity in the system, then we're failing. And this is actually, I think, quite shameful. If you take Cardiff, and I could choose any of these areas, and I could choose anywhere in Britain. Cardiff is not unique in this. This was 2014. It's a couple of years out of date, and it has improved a bit since then, which is great. Pupils on free school meals, 27% of them got the 5 good passes. Pupils not on free school meals, 60% got the 5 good passes. That is a massive, massive difference. Now, the Welsh Government is attempting to put money into this, but I do think as a city, if we can't get that bit right, then I think we can't claim to be a great city, if we've still got that kind of gap in attainment between different groups of young people. As I say, Cardiff is not unique. It's not unique in Wales, it's not unique in Britain, and as Andrew Schleicher said, it's not unique in the world. But I think we need to be seen to be addressing that. This is what we want. We want the attainment of all pupils to go up, but we want those of the PDG, the free school meal pupils, to go up faster. So we want everything going up, but the gap narrowing at the same time. That is our objective. And this takes me on to one of the things that I feel quite passionately about. And as I said, I think Cardiff's in a great position. And that is that a certain amount of this can be done in the classroom with better teaching, a better understanding of how children learn. But some of it takes place outside the classroom. And we have to provide that richness of experiences beyond the classroom for all our young people if we want them to be able to have the same opportunities as their more middle-class compatriots in school. Again, something, I don't want you to read it. It's impossible to read from where you are. There's an organisation in England which is called the Education Endowment Foundation. And what they are doing is they're putting a lot of money into trying to work out what it is that will enable us to narrow gaps. So there is a lot of science going into this, a lot of research going into this. We're even into using, somewhat dubiously, I think, random control testing to see if we can work out what makes a difference. But it is something which there's a huge amount of energy going into. If you're not in education, you might not be aware of that, but people are trying to find out, what can we do to narrow this gap? How can we get the children from more disadvantaged backgrounds achieving more highly? And what they do is they are testing each one of these things is some aspect of education which they have tested to try and work out what difference it makes to attainment. This business I've been talking about, educational capital, you can look at it in lots of different ways. I look at it in 3 ways. I think if you go back to my analogy of a middle-class child, one of the most interesting things in education in Britain in the last 20 years is the growth of tutoring. Middle-class family, child struggling with maths or science, get a tutor. Disadvantaged families can't do that. School needs to do that. School needs to provide the support, the one-to-one support and so on, that children would get if they were middle class. They need to get enrichment, the opportunities that Cardiff offers. They're out there. We need to get children using those. Raising aspirations, lots of children never come into contact with professionals, with people from different backgrounds. We need to get them into universities. Again, Cardiff's in a great position. 2 great universities. We need to get those young people in there from a very early age, having that aspiration. Again, unreadable. I'm good at that. It's the third one. In my last year at the school, I was trying to work out this question of educational capital. And I sat half a dozen pupils down and said to them, right, okay, in the 6 years you'd been in the school, they were in year 13 at the time, what have you done in the school? And we brainstormed it, and we came up with this list of things. And this is what we were able to do in London, the kind of opportunities they could offer. All sorts of things in sport, in music, in visiting universities, curriculum trips, museums, hosting visits from overseas, taking part in drama, all sorts of stuff. But that's the kind of things that we need in our schools. And as I said, I'm in danger of repeating myself. Cardiff can do that. Cardiff can do that in a way, you know, I wish it could be everywhere, but Cardiff has that fantastic potential to give their young people these kind of opportunities. So, how is this done? I think ambition. I think there was a very strong sense that poverty isn't an excuse. I came across, I'm sure you're familiar with it, I'd never heard of it until 3 years ago. What people told me they said is poor dabs. And I hate that expression because it implies something about that whole idea that, well, these children are from a difficult background, you can't expect much. I think we can't accept that. You need to have a sustained effort. This is not something that's going to happen quickly. We're talking about the British class system. The British class system has been entrenched for 200 years now. We're not going to change it overnight. But if we have ambition and we're prepared to make a big effort, we can start to make inroads. But it is something that is very, very well entrenched. Leadership, we need that. We need leadership at all levels, in the local authority, in the Welsh Government, in the schools. We need leadership. I don't think we invest enough in our leadership in Wales at the moment. Relationships, again, actually understanding what it is that we're doing. We do much greater depth there. And partnerships. I think this is going back to what I said earlier. Individual schools can improve. There are lots of good schools in Cardiff. We shouldn't be happy to have lots of good schools individually. We should want every school to be as good as we can possibly make it. And I think we have to create an environment where schools actually feel responsible for each other as well as for themselves. Going back to London, where there has been a huge improvement in London. London claims to be the only capital city in the developed world where the capital is the highest achieving region of the country, if that makes sense. So there are 9 regions in England. London is the highest achieving. In most capital cities, that's not the case. So they claim to be that, and they weren't 10 years ago. The official story is basically one that everybody tries to claim credit for this. So the government claimed credit, that was the Blair government in particular, for the high level of funding. People said, oh, it's because the ethnicity's changed. You've got a more aspirational population now. You know, Bangladeshi families, Indian families, African families coming in, higher aspirations. Other people said we've got programs like Teach First and other things which are getting people into the system. Better quality of teachers. Other people said this London Challenge is what made a difference. And other people said, actually, it's the government strategies to improve literacy and numeracy in primary schools. That's been the key to it. I think none of those individually changed what happened in London or happened in Tower Hamlets. It was much more than that. I think it was what I call the settlement. And I can't think, it's not a good word, and I wish I had another one. But by that, what I mean is that there was a consensus, certainly where I was in Tower Hamlets, which included the politicians, it included the local authority officers, it included the third sector, it included the schools themselves, the parents, the governors. There was an agreement that actually education is the single most important thing if we want to change our community. And people were prepared to put their own loyalties, their own particular... They were prepared to stop defending their own area in order to actually say, we're going to put our effort into this. And I think what happened then was that the whole was greater than the sum of the parts. So all of those things contributed, and other things as well. But it was that willingness to say, actually, we need to leave aside some of our own loyalty, some of our own, I suppose, defend our own interests even. And I have to say, in my experience in Wales, again, no different from anywhere else, I encounter quite a lot of that people are reluctant to actually share and say that the whole is greater than the sum of the part, and if we work together. And I think that was the key in Tower Hamlets and in London. Possible threats. This is educationally based, but I think it has a kind of resonance with other things as well. I think we have to be very careful of narrow accountability levers. Ofsted in England, Eston in Wales. I think there's a danger that they focus us on too narrow a range. And my big fear there is that the schools that most need that capital, that educational capital, that broad education, are the ones, because of accountability, that are focusing on a very narrow education. And we may end up in 5 or 10 years' time with an apparent narrowing of the gap, but in terms of the young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, they're still unable to compete because they haven't got that educational capital. So that it may look better, but it may not be better. League tables you haven't got, mercifully. We've got those in England still, but you have got high-stake tests, and we need to be careful how we use those. People play games with those and don't necessarily give children the best education they want. And I stick this up because I think what I've seen in England, and I think could happen here, is that you end up, and I think this has parallels beyond schools as well, you end up, I think there are two models. The first of those models of school leadership is the one which I think is taking hold in England, which is the one which is just accountability and attainment and tests are everything. And schools focus on those in a very narrow way. I think that is very dangerous. And we're developing school leaders there who think in a very narrow way. They haven't got any sense of the breadth of what education should be. I think the second model is the one that we want in Cardiff, the one which we want high attainment for our pupils, but we can achieve that and give them a broad education at the same time. I think the two are not incompatible. The danger is that people are driven to the first one because of the fear of the accountability. Again, I'm back to Andreas Schleicher. Today's schooling needs to be much more about ways of thinking involving creativity, critical thinking, problem solving, and decision making. It's not just about getting 5 or 6 or 7 GCSEs at a C grade. We've made it. I think if we go down too far down that track, we will end up in a few years' time, further behind in one sense. Attainment may look better, but we will end up behind. We have to be courageous about that. And I think the Welsh Government has been courageous in terms of the curriculum. They are going for a new curriculum. I think, I've got a feeling that there ought to still be a greater emphasis on vocational education. I think we haven't got that right yet. And I think 50% of our young people, at least, if not more, will not go to university. So what are we saying to those 50% of children? Or in the case of Cardiff, the 70% of the free school meals children who didn't get 5 passes. What are we offering them? And I think as a great city, we have to care about those children as well. And we can't be a great city if we aren't really addressing that and doing something about it. I think my kind of lessons from this would be as you'd expect, I think education is fundamental to all of this. We have to invest in our teachers. We need to value them. One of the biggest things that happened in London was that Tim Brighouse, who had been in Birmingham, came along, and he managed to raise the status of teaching again. I think in Wales there has been a tradition of teaching being quite a high-status profession. I think it slipped a bit. I think we want to get it back as a really high status profession, and we want to invest in our teachers. I think we have to invest in leadership. Preschool, I think if we're going to change this for disadvantaged young people, we have to get in there early, vocational education, and a 21st century curriculum, including that vocational education. I think that's basically what I want to say. I think, as I said at the beginning, my sense is that Cardiff is on the cusp of something, and it could actually really take off. As far as education goes, and education's part in that, I think we need to look around, we need to learn from the experiences, both positive and negative, of our neighbours in England and in Scotland. But above all, I would argue, we need to recognise that unless we care about all the pupils, unless we create an education system which is concerned with every child, then I think we will not ever become a great city. Thank you.
We've got a chance for some questions now. So if there's any from the audience, we've got a roving microphone to help you be heard, if anyone's not too shy. Is anybody? Thank you.
Hi, this is not on. There we go. Hi, that was great, Alistair. I work in the transport industry, and there's a big issue about a pipeline of people who can do the kind of work that's needed in the transport industry. And there's a lot of debate within the industry about how the industry can support primary and secondary education, but I don't feel that really works very well at the moment. What's your view on how industry and education can work together? Do you think that's a bit of a red herring, or have you seen good practice for how that works well?
I think it's probably... I think this whole question of vocational education is possibly one of the biggest failings of the British education system. I think we have, more than most other countries, become obsessed with a traditional academic type education. And in the course of my career, I saw lots of occasions when we tried to change that, and we tried to get industry and business involved, and it never really took off. I think because... I think structurally schools are set up in a way in which what is valued is the academic results. Now, I think that we need to move on. We're in a situation now where all young people are supposed to stay in education in some form till the age of 18. And I personally would like to see much greater... I don't think we should have children going to vocational education at too young an age, because I think if you do, then the young people from more disadvantaged backgrounds will almost inevitably drift into that. I don't want to see that. But I think at 16, we could see a much greater emphasis on vocational education, give it much higher status. And I think there's a huge role then for industry and business to play, but it needs a lot of work. It's not just about people saying, oh, we'd like to help, or we'll do this, or we'll do that. We'll have some children on work experience or something. It needs to be gone into much greater depth. I do think the idea of apprenticeships is a really good one. I think there's a lot of work to be done on it still, the kind of higher level apprenticeships. But I have noticed for the first time this year that actually quite a lot of 18-year-olds are now talking about not going to university, and a lot of them are saying, actually, getting £50,000 in debt, you know, there used to be a graduate premium that you would earn more money if you're a graduate. I'm not convinced that all 50% of people who go to university should. And I think there's a growing interest in these apprenticeships post-18, but I think huge opportunities at 16 as well for industry and business to become involved and to recognise the mutual interest in that.
Olwen Mosley from Cardiff School of Art and Design, Cardiff Metropolitan University. I just want to follow on from that really about the danger of overemphasising vocational education, particularly from a skills point of view. What are the skills gaps that we've got? if we accept that 60% of today's school children, leavers, whatever, first year people in university, are going to be in jobs that don't exist yet in 10 years' time, if we over-rely on apprenticeships in businesses now, that exist now, isn't that going to create more problems? I like the bit that you said about creativity, critical thinking, problem solving and decision making. The very skills and career focused education can miss out on that sometimes.
Yeah, I would agree with you completely. That's why I said I think certainly not before 16. I'm very, very suspicious of, there's a move in England, they've got these schools called University Technical Colleges, UTCs, and children can go there at the age of 14. Well, they have to decide at the age of 13 if they want to go there or not. So they're making these decisions at the age of 13, and I think that's far too early. I agree with you, but I also think that, putting it quite crudely, there are young people who are going to university, spending 3 years in university, coming out, and then doing the same job as people who left school at 18 and have been 3 years working in the company. So I think it's not that simple. But I agree with you that we don't want to train people, too many people, for jobs that won't exist in 10 or 20 years' time. At the same time, they exist now, and somebody's doing them, so we need people into them. But we need to have greater flexibility in our workforce, and that's why I think everyone should have a common education up to 16, so that they've got those basic skills. But I would also argue, and again, going back to my negativity about some of the English things, one of the great, I think, tragedies of English education at the moment is the marginalisation of music, drama, art, technology. It's just, I spoke to a friend of mine whose son is 10 and choosing his secondary school. He went to a prospective secondary school 2 weeks ago now, and the head teacher spoke, and he asked a question, so what's the place of music in the school here? And the head teacher said, there isn't any. We're focusing on the EBAC, academic subjects. Music, you can do that outside school. You could cry, really. I mean, it's just that vision that we've narrowed education down to just English, maths, science, geography, history, modern foreign languages, and nothing else is desperate.
Ken Poole,
Yes, Ken.
Cardiff Council. I'm also a governor. So any lessons that you can share with us on how we obtain more effective engagement with parents and the families, particularly in some of the challenging schools and some of the challenging communities that we have?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've got kind of slightly ambivalent views about this. I think the first thing I would say is if we want to engage with parents, it has to happen as early as possible. It has to happen before they get to school and in primary school. I think as a secondary head teacher, we were continually told about we should be working with parents, engaging with parents. It's too late. Most of you will be parents. If you turned up at the school gates of a primary school, you'd be welcome. If you turned up at the gates of a secondary school, your child would be embarrassed. They'd say, go and hide round the corner and wait for me there. I don't want to be seen with my parent. And I think that in a school I was in, 1,200, latterly 1,500 pupils, we had, allowing for some single-parent families, 2,500 parents. There is very little that as a head teacher I can do with 2,500 parents. But a primary school with 30 kids in each year group, maybe 60 in each year group, or even less, I think you can actually engage there. And I think that's where we have to do it. I think by secondary school, our ambition was we want every parent to attend the parents' evenings and talk about their child individually. But in terms of trying to engage them through the kind of PTA type thing, we couldn't do it. It wasn't feasible. But we did want to see every single parent, and we would pursue every parent who didn't come to make sure we had about their child individually. But I think in primary school and even preschool, you can do a lot more. The relationship's very, very different with parents in the primary school.
Hi, Alice Carlton, Capital Law. I found your talk very interesting for a number of reasons, not least because I lived and worked in East London for 12 years. I arrived in Stepney Green in 2002, lived in Stepney, lived in Bethnal Green, lived in Hackney, and worked in Spitalfields. So I was there for 12 years before moving back to Cardiff, where I'm from. One of the things that you didn't mention was actually the change in the area around those places over the course, particularly I think of the last 15 years. It's a horrible term, but certainly gentrification is the one that is always used. Do you think that that has had an effect on the schools in that part of London?
I would say very limited. The reason I would say that is that, in my experience, the vast majority of the people who are involved in gentrification send their child to the local primary school, but when it comes to secondary education, they either move out or send them privately or whatever. We had a school with an intake of 240 pupils a year in Bethnal Green, and I would say on average the number of children that I would say where one of the parents was from a professional background was in single figures, and that didn't really shift much. In fact, it was probably slightly higher in the 1990s than it was in the 2000s. I don't think it's made that much of a difference. But I am a great advocate of mixed schools. I really just, I just wish we could have much greater. I think busing's a bit extreme. I think busing, well, it is extreme. You can't do it. But there's something about, I think one of the great advantages of schools in places like Cardiff is that the diversity of the pupils, I think, gives an added dimension to the children's education. I think if you happen to, and you can't help your circumstances, but if you go to a posh public school, in, I don't know, Marlborough or Winchester or somewhere, you will mix with people who are exactly the same as you, white, fairly wealthy, middle-class people. If you go to a good comprehensive in Cardiff or in London, the diversity of people you meet will, I think, enrich you as an individual, but it will also make you, I think, better equipped to survive and to be a success in our society. I think there's a huge amount to be said for growing up and going to school in a diverse, multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious school. I think it's great for kids, and I think those young people develop emotional intelligence far in excess of their counterparts who go to more exclusive schools. Didn't really answer your question. I think the answer is no, it didn't make a great deal of difference. I should have said that, shouldn't I?
I'm going to hold, I know there's another question, but we will have a panel after to wrap up some more questions, but I want to make sure that we also stay to time, as that is part of my role. So thank you very much, Alistair.
Okay.